Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to a world where the quiet scratch of a quill on parchment was the loudest sound you'd hear for miles. Imagine yourself there, in the deep chill of a medieval monastery, the scent of old vellum and beeswax clinging to the damp stone. You can almost feel the cold seeping into your bones, even through layers of rough wool, as the last rays of watery sunlight fade from the high arched windows. Outside, the world is a chaotic, bustling, often terrifying place, full of brigands, plagues, and very questionable dental hygiene. But inside these thick walls, a different kind of life unfolds. A life dedicated to silence, prayer, and, perhaps, most surprisingly, the painstaking preservation of knowledge. You're about to experience the surprisingly unglamorous yet utterly essential daily grind of a medieval monk whose job it was to copy books by candlelight. And let me tell you, if you think your job has tight deadlines, try copying an entire Bible by hand before the invention of coffee breaks. You probably won't survive this for more than a day, let alone a lifetime. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these sleepy stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the threshold of the monastery gate, a heavy, oak-bound portal that groans open with a deep, resonant sigh, echoing the profound shift that's about to occur in your life, the world. You know, the clamor of the market, the distant cries of street vendors, the earthy smell of unwashed humanity. All of it begins to recede as you step over the threshold. This isn't just a physical boundary. It's a spiritual one, a demarcation between the seculum, the secular world, and the sacred space of the monastic enclosure. You've made the decision, for reasons deeply personal, spiritual, or perhaps simply practical, in a world offering few other paths, to join this community. You might be a younger son with no inheritance, a scholar seeking refuge, or simply a soul yearning for quiet contemplation away from the pervasive chaos of medieval life. The air inside is immediately different, cooler, quieter. The only sounds are the soft rustle of your tunic against your legs and the distant, rhythmic clang of a hammer from the monastery's workshops. Perhaps a blacksmith mending a tool, or a carpenter shaping wood. The architecture itself seems to breathe a kind of solemn tranquility. High stone walls, built for defense as much as for devotion, rise around you, enclosing courtyards, cloisters, and the austere, yet strangely comforting, outline of the abbey church. As you are led through the various parts of the monastery, you begin to grasp the sheer self-sufficiency of this isolated community. This isn't just a place of worship, it's a miniature universe unto itself. You pass by the refectory, where meals are taken in silence, often with a monk reading aloud from scripture. The kitchens, no doubt, are a hive of activity during meal times, preparing simple, nourishing food from the monastery's own fields and gardens. Then there are the dormitories, rows of simple beds, often unheated, where the monks sleep for just a few hours before the cycle of prayer begins anew. You might catch a glimpse of the infirmary, a place where the sick are tended with herbal remedies and prayers, or the guest house, for the rare traveler or pilgrim granted hospitality. There are workshops for everything from shoemaking to brewing ale, ensuring the community can largely provide for its own needs. It's a fascinating, almost self-contained ecosystem, thriving in an age where external supply chains were tenuous at best. Historians still argue whether the monastic emphasis on self-sufficiency was primarily spiritual, designed to foster humility and detachment from worldly goods, or simply a practical necessity given the unpredictable nature of medieval trade and governance. Either way, it meant a lot of chores. Your initial days are a blur of new routines and unfamiliar expectations. You learn the monastic horarium, the strict schedule of prayers that punctuate the day and night, from matins in the deep pre-dawn, darkness to compline just before sleep. Your life becomes a rhythmic chant, a measured pace set by the bells that peal from the abbey tower. You learn to walk with purpose, but without haste, to speak only when necessary, and to listen with a keen ear to the subtle cues of monastic life. Silence, you quickly discover, is not merely the absence of noise. It is a presence, a living entity, that permeates every stone and every breath within these walls. It's a silence that demands your respect, almost like a grumpy librarian guarding the fiction section. One of the first things you notice, perhaps after the shock of waking before dawn becomes a dull ache, is the chill. Stone walls are excellent at retaining cold, and heating, when it existed at all, was rudimentary. You quickly learn to appreciate the warmth of your own body heat under rough woolen blankets, and the brief, fleeting warmth offered by a brazier in a common room if you're lucky enough to be near one. Personal fires are a luxury almost unheard of for most monks. Your hands, perpetually cool, will soon grow accustomed to the slight dampness in the air, a constant companion in these ancient buildings. You're given your simple monastic habit, a rough woolen tunic, a cowl for warmth, and perhaps a scapular, a long piece of cloth worn over the shoulders, often with symbolic meaning. This uniform strips away any lingering vestiges of your former identity, asserting your new role within the community. It's surprisingly scratchy. You quickly realize that monastic life isn't about comfort, it's about discipline, and perhaps a bit about developing a tolerance for wool as you settle in. You notice the other monks, each pursuing their assigned duties with quiet dedication. Some are in the fields, tending crops. Others are in the kitchens, preparing simple meals of gruel and vegetables. Still others are engaged in manual labor, mending buildings, or fetching water. But a select few, you observe, disappear into a specific part of the monastery, often near the church or the cloister. They carry small bags of tools, and their faces often bear a look of intense concentration, sometimes illuminated by the flicker of a lamp, even during the day. This is the scriptorium, the heart of the monastery's intellectual life, and soon it will be your domain. You're drawn to it, perhaps by a natural inclination towards scholarly pursuits, or perhaps by the abbot's discerning eye. You've been chosen, or have chosen yourself, for the quiet, solitary work of a scribe. This isn't a task for the faint of heart, or for those easily distracted by the flight of a fly. It demands immense patience, unwavering focus, and a steady hand. It's a career path that offers little in the way of worldly glory, but immeasurable spiritual reward, or so you're told. The transition isn't instantaneous. You'll spend time observing, learning the monastic rules by rote, understanding the subtle hierarchy, and, crucially, mastering the art of silent communication. A nod, a gesture, a specific look, these become your language in a world where words are precious and used sparingly. It's a far cry from the constant stream of notifications and background chatter you might be used to. Here, the loudest sound might be the distant cooing of doves or the rustle of leaves outside a window. The quiet demands a different kind of attention, an inward turning that can be both unsettling and profoundly peaceful. It's like SMR, but with actual consequences if you mess up. Your life here is a continuous cycle of prayer, work, and contemplation. There's a certain stoicism required, a willingness to embrace austerity. The food is simple, the living conditions basic, and the schedule relentless. But there's also a powerful sense of community, of shared purpose. You are part of something much larger than yourself, a spiritual endeavor that spans centuries. And within this disciplined framework, your particular task awaits: to enter the hushed, cold realm of the scriptorium and join the silent ranks of those who preserved knowledge for generations to come. You are about to become a guardian of words, a silent witness to history, armed only with a quill, some ink, and an almost superhuman amount of patience. You step into the scriptorium, and the first thing that truly strikes you, beyond the chill that seems to cling to the very stones, is the silence. It's not an ordinary silence, not the absence of sound you'd find in an empty room. This is a profound, almost tangible, quiet, broken only by the faintest, most delicate sounds, the whisper-soft turning of a page, the rhythmic scratch-scratch-scratch of a quill, and the occasional, almost imperceptible sigh of a monk adjusting his posture. It's the kind of silence that demands respect, almost like you've walked into a library where the books are judging your every breath. The room itself is often a long, rectangular hall, bathed in the soft, diffused light filtering through tall, narrow windows. These windows, essential for illumination in an age before electric lights, are usually positioned high on the wall, angled to catch as much daylight as possible without exposing the delicate manuscripts to direct damaging sunbeams. You notice the air is often cool, sometimes even damp, a constant battle against the elements that could warp parchment or smudge precious ink. There's no roaring fireplace here. Warmth is a luxury that could pose a fire hazard to irreplaceable texts. The only heat you might feel is the faint warmth from a small brazier, carefully positioned, if allowed at all, or the shared body heat of your fellow scribes. Each monk is seated at a carrel, a small, individual wooden desk or cubicle. These aren't ergonomic masterpieces, I assure you. They are often simple, sturdy affairs designed for functionality rather than comfort. You find your own carrel, a humble wooden structure worn smooth in places by countless hours of elbows, resting, and fingers tracing lines of text. The surface is sloped, an ingenious design that allows the scribe to work at a more comfortable angle, reducing strain on the back and neck, though you'll quickly discover comfortable is a relative term in this era. Beneath the sloped top, there might be a small shelf or compartment for storing essential tools. Around you, other monks are already at work, hunched over their manuscripts, their concentration absolute. Their cowls are pulled up, sometimes obscuring their faces, not just for warmth, but to aid in their intense focus, creating a tiny, private world within the larger, quiet room. They move with a slow, deliberate grace, their hands performing ancient, practiced rituals. One monk meticulously rules lines on a fresh sheet of parchment. Another carefully sharpens his quill, while a third, perhaps an older, more experienced scribe, applies a delicate touch of gold leaf to an illuminated initial. The atmosphere is one of profound diligence. There's no chatter, no gossip, no complaining about the draft. Every action is purposeful, every movement measured. This isn't just about making copies. It's an act of devotion, a spiritual exercise. Each letter painstakingly formed, each word accurately transcribed is a prayer in itself, a contribution to the glorification of God and the preservation of His Word. You understand that this isn't simply a job. It's a calling, demanding an almost superhuman level of patience and humility. Imagine trying to get through your workday without your phone, without Spotify, just the sound of your own breathing and the occasional distant cough. That's your new normal. The discipline of the scriptorium extends beyond just silence. You learn to conserve light, turning your body to catch the best angle of daylight, and later, guarding your precious candle or lamp as if it were a rare jewel. These aren't the bright, energy-efficient LED lights we take for granted. This is the flickering, smoky glow of a beeswax candle or an oil lamp, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls and struggling to truly illuminate the fine details of the text. It makes you appreciate how much easier life is when you're not constantly squinting. Historians still argue whether medieval scriptoria were always as meticulously quiet as popular imagination suggests, or if a low hum of activity, perhaps whispered, consultations or the rustle of materials might have been present. However, the ideal, as laid out in monastic rules like the Rule of Saint Benedict, certainly emphasized silence and contemplation, creating an environment conducive to deep, uninterrupted work. It was, in many ways, the original deep work environment. Centuries before the concept was popularized, you realize quickly that the pace of work is slow, excruciatingly slow by modern standards. A single page might take hours, a single book months, or even years to complete. There's no rush, no pressing deadline beyond the inherent desire to complete the sacred task. Quality, accuracy, and beauty are paramount. A misplaced letter, a smudged line, a poorly ruled margin. These are not just errors. They are imperfections in an offering to God. The role of the scribe was highly respected within the monastic community, though perhaps not always understood by the outside world. While many monks were assigned to manual labor in the fields or workshops, those with the literacy and artistic skill to work in the scriptorium were seen as contributing to the spiritual and intellectual heart of the monastery. It wasn't uncommon for monks to specialize. Some were expert calligraphers, others masterful illuminators, and some still were responsible for the meticulous work of correcting and proofreading. It was, in essence, a medieval assembly line, but one where each stage was a work of art in itself. You begin to observe the tools of the trade, laid out carefully on your carrel or on the work surfaces of your fellow monks. They are simple, yet remarkably effective. Quills, made from the flight feathers of large birds like geese, swans, or even crows, lie waiting. their tips carefully cut and split to hold and release ink with precision. Small pots of ink, some black, some red, stand ready. There are compasses for drawing perfect circles, rulers for straight lines, and lead points for sketching initial designs that could later be erased. It's like a specialized toolkit for a very particular kind of artisanal craft. Except instead of building a house, you're building a book, one letter at a time. As you spend more time in the scriptorium, you become attuned to its rhythm, its almost meditative pulse. The faint light outside shifts, signaling the passage of the hours. The chill deepens as evening approaches, and eventually the precious candles are lit. The soft, golden glow transforms the room, making the shadows dance, turning the carols into intimate cocoons of light, each housing a silent, dedicated figure. The air, once merely cool, now carries the faint scent of melting beeswax and warm parchment. This is when the true work begins, or rather continues, long into the night, often until the first bells of matins call the monks back to prayer. You learn to ignore the gnawing ache in your back, the stiffness in your neck, the slight tremor in your hand from hours of precise work. You learn to breathe with the rhythm of the quill, to let your mind empty of all but the task at hand. It is a form of deep contemplation, an active meditation. Each stroke of the quill, each meticulously formed letter, becomes a testament to faith, to patience, and to the enduring power of the written word in a world where it was a rare and precious commodity. The scriptorium isn't just a place of work, it's a sanctuary. Outside, the world is turbulent, often violent. Knowledge is fragile, easily lost to war, fire, or simple neglect. But here, within these quiet walls, under the flickering light of a candle, that knowledge is painstakingly preserved, copied, and passed down. You are a link in a long, unbroken chain, a guardian of stories, scriptures, and ancient wisdom. And as the hours stretch on and the silence deepens, you find a strange, profound comfort in the steady rhythm of your quill, carving out words into the waiting silence. Your days in the monastery quickly fall into a rhythm, a precise dance, choreographed by the chiming of bells and the rising and setting of the sun. The life of a scribe, while seemingly sedentary, is anything but easy. It demands a rigorous schedule, unwavering discipline, and a physical stamina you might not have anticipated. You discover that relaxing here means not having to haul rocks for a few hours. Your day begins brutally in the deep pre-dawn darkness, often around 2 or 3 a.m., with the first bell calling you to matins, the night prayer. You stumble out of your rough bed in the dormitory, the air biting cold, and join the procession of cowled figures shuffling towards the abbey church. The only light comes from flickering lanterns carried by a few monks, casting long, dancing shadows that make the familiar hallways seem eerie and vast. In the church, you stand or kneel for what feels like an eternity, chanting psalms in a low murmur, your voice blending with dozens of others. It's a somber, meditative start to the day, designed to focus the mind on spiritual matters before the worldly tasks begin. If you thought hitting snooze was hard, try rolling out of bed for church when it's still technically yesterday. After matins, there might be a brief return to the dormitory for a couple more hours of restless sleep, or immediately into lauds, the morning prayer, as the first hints of gray light touch the eastern sky. Then comes prime at sunrise, followed by the first communal meal of the day, often a meager affair of bread, gruel, and perhaps some weak ale or water. It's enough to sustain you, but certainly not enough to make you feel well fed. This simple diet is part of the monastic discipline, a constant reminder of humility and detachment from worldly pleasures. Once these morning rituals are complete, the workday truly begins. For you, this means heading straight to the scriptorium. You might spend a few hours there, immersed in the quiet concentration of copying. But the monastic life is one of balance. Ora et labora, pray and work. So, your time in the scriptorium is often interspersed with other duties. You might be called upon to work in the monastery gardens, tending vegetables or herbs, or perhaps in the fields, helping with the harvest. You could be assigned to the kitchen, peeling vegetables, or assisting the refectorian in setting up for meals. There are always repairs to be made, wood to be chopped, water to be drawn from the well. It's a stark contrast to the delicate work of the quill, reminding you that even the most intellectual monks were expected to contribute to the physical upkeep of the community. It's like having a job where you code all morning, then spend the afternoon digging ditches. Keeps you humble, I guess. Around noon, the bell rings for sext, another round of prayers, followed by the main meal of the day, again in the refectory, often in silence. This meal might be slightly more substantial than breakfast, but still simple. Beans, grains, bread, and occasionally fish, especially during Lent. Meat was generally forbidden unless you were ill. Then, a short period of rest or quiet reading before the afternoon work begins. The afternoon typically sees you back in the scriptorium, the light perhaps stronger now, but the chill still persistent. You work diligently, the rhythm of your quill becoming second nature. You might be so engrossed that you barely notice the passing of time, only vaguely aware of the changing light outside the window. This is the period of most sustained focus, where many pages are slowly filled with your careful hand as the sun begins its descent. The bell calls for nones, another prayer service, followed by vespers, the evening prayer, as twilight deepens. This is often a beautiful, contemplative service, with the soft glow of candles illuminating the church and the monks' voices echoing softly in the growing dusk. After vespers, there might be a final, simple meal, a collation, perhaps just a piece of bread and a cup of water or weak ale. Then comes Compline, the final prayer of the day, recited in near darkness, a solemn closing to the day's labors. After Compline, absolute silence descends upon the monastery, known as the Grand Silence, which lasts until after prime the following morning. During this time, no one speaks. You retreat to your dormitory, weary, but perhaps with a quiet sense of accomplishment, and fall into a deep, dreamless sleep, only to be awakened a few short hours later by the matins bell. This relentless, cyclical routine is designed not just for spiritual discipline, but also for efficiency. By structuring every hour, the monastery maximizes its output, whether in prayer, physical labor, or intellectual pursuits. It's a very early example of time management, predating your productivity apps by about 1,000 years. Historians still debate the extent to which individual monks found this rigorous schedule spiritually uplifting or simply physically draining. While the ideal was spiritual focus, the reality was often exhaustion. For a scribe, the routine also includes specific duties related to your craft. Before sitting down at your carrel, you might spend time preparing your materials. This could mean sharpening quills, mixing fresh batches of ink, or, if you're particularly skilled, preparing sheets of parchment. This preparatory work is crucial. A dull quill or poorly mixed ink could ruin hours of careful copying. You quickly learn that patience is not just a virtue, but an absolute necessity. You also learn to conserve your strength and your eyes. The medieval scriptorium, even with its windows, could be dim, especially on cloudy days or in the long winter months. Copying fine script by the flickering light of a candle or oil lamp for hours on end takes an immense toll on your eyesight. Many older scribes would have suffered from poor vision, their eyes strained by the relentless precision required. This is why monks often developed specific posture and lighting techniques, angling their bodies and their manuscripts to catch the best possible light. Imagine trying to read tiny print on a screen with the brightness turned way down for hours every single day. That's pretty close to the medieval scribe's reality. The silence of the scriptorium is not merely enforced, it becomes a part of you. You learn to appreciate it, to use it as a tool for concentration. In this profound quiet, your thoughts can become clearer, your focus sharper. You are not distracted by idle chatter or the clamor of the outside world. It's a meditative state, almost, where the act of copying becomes a form of prayer. Each stroke of the quill a whispered devotion. There's a quirky tidbit you might discover. Some monasteries had specific rules about even the sounds made by scribes. For instance, in certain Benedictine houses, if a monk needed a specific tool or material, he was not to speak. Instead, he would use a system of hand signals. Pointing to his ear meant he needed to consult a book, making a sweeping gesture over a page could mean he needed more parchment, and perhaps most amusingly, stroking his beard meant he needed to talk to a superior. It was the original silent office communication, predating Slack by centuries. Despite the hardships, there's a profound satisfaction that comes from your work. Each completed page, each finished chapter is a small victory. You are not just copying words, you are preserving wisdom, faith, and the very fabric of knowledge. In an era where books were rare and precious, each one was a treasure, and you are creating them, one painstaking letter at a time. The cumulative effort of monks like you, working in quiet scriptoria across Europe, ensured that countless ancient texts, both sacred and secular, survived the turbulent medieval period. Without your diligent, quiet, and often cold work, much of the classical knowledge we have today would have simply vanished into the mists of time. You are, in essence, a human photocopier, but with way more spiritual enlightenment and significantly worse snacks. This constant cycle of prayer, physical labor, and intellectual work shapes you, body and soul. You become accustomed to the cold, the simple food, the early mornings, and the late nights. Your hands develop calluses, your back a persistent ache, but your mind becomes sharper, more focused. The outside world, with its fleeting concerns, seems distant and irrelevant. Your world is now confined to these walls, this routine, and the endless, fascinating task of bringing words to life on parchment under the gentle, flickering glow of a medieval candle. Now that you're settled into the quiet rhythm of the scriptorium. Your attention turns to the very heart of your craft, the tools. Forget your sleek laptops and perfectly weighted pens. The medieval scribe worked with implements that were both rudimentary and surprisingly sophisticated, each one requiring a delicate touch and constant maintenance. You soon learn that your success, or rather, the success of the manuscript you're working on, hinges entirely on the quality and care of these simple items. First, and perhaps most iconic, is the quill pen. This isn't just any old feather you might find lying on the ground. These were carefully selected flight feathers from large birds, most commonly geese, but also swans, crows, or even turkeys, chosen for their stiffness and the natural curve of their shaft. The best quills came from the left wing of the bird, which curved away from the scribe's hand, preventing ink from splattering as they wrote. Who knew bird anatomy was so critical to literacy? You quickly discover the tedious process of preparing a quill. Its quill dressing or hardening. This involved soaking the feathers in water for a few days, then baking them in hot sand or ashes to stiffen them and make them less prone to splitting. After this, the tip would be cut at an angle with a small, sharp knife, your penknife, and a slit made down the center to allow the ink to flow evenly. This isn't a one-and-done job. Quills wear out quickly, so you're constantly resharpening, recutting, and replacing them. It's a bit like being a medieval barista, constantly grinding beans. Except your beans are feathers, and your coffee is ink. Next, you need something to write on. Forget paper. That's a relatively new invention, still making its slow way into Europe during the medieval period. Your canvas is parchment or vellum, while we'll delve into their creation in the next section. Suffice it to say now that these are incredibly durable, smooth surfaces made from treated animal skins, typically calf, sheep, or goat. Vellum, specifically from calves, is considered the finest quality, incredibly smooth and creamy. Parchment, being more readily available, is what you'll likely use most often. It has a slightly textured feel, almost like very thin, stiff leather. The quality varies greatly. Some sheets are supple and bright, others stiff and uneven. Handling it, you realize its immense value. Each sheet represents not just animal life, but significant labor. Of course, a pen is useless without ink. The primary ink used is iron gall ink, a remarkably stable and durable substance that has preserved countless manuscripts for centuries. It's made from a fascinating, almost alchemical combination of oak galls, those knobby growths on oak trees caused by wasps, ferrous sulfate, iron salts, and gum arabic, a resin from acacia trees, as a binder, all mixed with water or wine. The galls contain tannins, which react with the iron salts to produce a deep black color that darkens over time as it oxidizes. This is why some very old manuscripts might have text that appears reddish-brown. It's the ink reacting with the air over hundreds of years. Red ink, often used for rubrics, headings, or emphasized text, derived from the Latin ruber for red, was usually made from cinnabar, a mercury sulfide, red lead, or plant-based dyes. You'll become adept at grinding pigments and mixing these simple ingredients into viscous liquids, careful to get the consistency just right. Too thick and it won't flow. Too thin and it will bleed. To prepare your parchment for writing, you need to rule it. Medieval scribes didn't just freehand their lines. that would lead to crooked text and a messy manuscript. Instead, they used a ruler, often a straight piece of wood or bone, and a stylus or lead point. Before the widespread use of lead pencils, scribes would use a piece of lead or a silver point to lightly draw guidelines on the parchment. These lines would be almost invisible once the ink was applied, but they were absolutely crucial for maintaining straight margins, even lines of text, and consistent spacing between lines. This meticulous preparation ensured a beautiful, uniform appearance that would be utterly ruined by a single wobbly line. It's like setting up a grid for your digital art, but if your grid was actually etched into the canvas. For the more intricate work of illumination, the decorative initials, and miniature illustrations, a different set of tools is required. You'll use fine brushes, often made from squirrel hair, for applying pigments. These pigments, a dazzling array of colors, were derived from minerals, plants, and sometimes even insects. Lapis lazuli for brilliant blue, vermilion for vibrant red, malachite for green, and crushed insects like cochineal for a rich crimson. These pigments would be ground into fine powders, mixed with a binder like egg yolk, making tempera paint, or gum arabic, and then applied with incredible precision. And for the ultimate touch of luxury and sacredness, there's gold leaf, incredibly thin sheets of pure gold, applied with an adhesive and then burnished to a dazzling shine with an agate burnisher. This entire process, from grinding to application, required an artisan's touch and an artist's eye. You also need a way to keep your page steady. Often, a small weight or press would be used to hold down the parchment, which could curl or buckle due to humidity or the inherent nature of the material. Sometimes, you'd work on a slanted desk known as a lectern, which made the physical act of writing a little less strenuous on your back. Historians still argue whether some monastic scriptoria used communal tables where monks worked side by side, or predominantly individual carrels. Evidence suggests both arrangements existed, often depending on the size and wealth of the monastery. However, the ideal was clearly a focused individual workspace to minimize distraction. Beyond the immediate tools of writing and illumination, the scriptorium itself had essential, if less obvious, aids. There were bookshelves or chests where finished manuscripts were stored, often chained to the shelves to prevent theft, a testament to their immense value. You might find a compass for drawing perfect circles in your designs, or a prickle, a sharp tool used to make tiny holes along the edges of the parchment. This method ensured incredible accuracy across multiple pages. Imagine having to poke hundreds of tiny, evenly spaced holes before you could even start drawing your lines. That's commitment. The overall atmosphere of the scriptorium, then, is one of precise, quiet industry. Every tool has a purpose. Every movement is deliberate. There's a particular smell to the room, the faint, earthy scent of parchment, the metallic temps of iron gall ink, perhaps the subtle, sweet aroma of beeswax from candles. It's a sensory experience that grounds you deeply in the moment, making you acutely aware of the materials and the meticulous process. One quirky tidbit you might encounter involves the occasional, almost whimsical, additions scribes would make to their margins. These are called marginalia, or drolleries. While most of the text was sacred and serious, sometimes a scribe, perhaps bored or simply feeling playful, would sketch a small, often humorous figure in the margin, a rabbit riding a snail, a grotesque monster, or a knight fighting a dragon. These little doodles, often completely unrelated to the text, offer a fascinating glimpse into the human side of these devoted copyists. It's like finding a tiny, hilarious meme tucked into the corner of an ancient sacred text. The maintenance of these tools is a continuous process. You learn to sharpen your penknife to a razor's edge, to clean your quills meticulously after each use to prevent clogging, and to store your precious pigments and inks carefully to prevent spoilage or spillage. A scribe's personal toolkit was often quite minimal, but each item was highly valued and expertly cared for. It's a testament to the ingenuity and resourcefulness of medieval craftspeople, who could create works of enduring beauty and knowledge with relatively simple means. As you become more proficient, handling these tools feels less like a chore and more like an extension of your own hand. The quill glides smoothly across the parchment, leaving a crisp black line. The ink flows just right, neither too fast nor too slow. You develop a sensitive touch, an intuitive understanding of your materials. And as the hours tick by, under the patient glow of a flickering candle, you realize that these humble tools are not just instruments. They are partners in the monumental task of preserving the written word, one precise stroke at a time. The silence, the chill, the relentless focus all fade into the background as you become one with the pen, the ink, and the waiting page. Now, let's talk about the canvas itself, parchment and vellum. While you might think of paper as the default writing surface, in the medieval scriptorium, it was these meticulously prepared animal skins that held the words of scripture, philosophy, and history. Creating them was an industry in itself, messy, smelly, and incredibly labor-intensive. A far cry from pulling a sheet of printer paper from a ream. You're about to appreciate why a single medieval book was such an astronomical expense. The journey of a manuscript begins long before a scribe even picks up a quill. It starts, rather unglamorously, with an animal, typically a calf, sheep, or goat. The finest quality, known as vellum, came from the skins of young calves, sometimes even stillborn ones, prized for their exceptional smoothness, suppleness, and pale, almost translucent color. Sheep and goat skins yielded parchment, which was generally thicker, often with a more pronounced grain or texture, and sometimes a slightly yellower hue. The choice of animal could depend on regional availability, cost, or the desired quality of the final manuscript. Imagine telling your boss your new project needs 36 baby cow skins before you can even start. Once the animal was slaughtered, not usually by the monks themselves, but by local butchers, the raw skin, still hairy and fleshy, would arrive at the monastery or a specialized parchment-making workshop. This is where the truly pungent work began. The first step was to soak the skins in vats of lime water. This wasn't just any water. It was water infused with calcium hydroxide, a highly alkaline substance. The purpose of this foul-smelling bath, which could last for several days or even weeks, was twofold: to loosen the hair and to break down any remaining flesh and fatty tissues clinging to the skin. You can imagine the smell. It certainly wasn't the fresh linen scent you might prefer while working. This step was crucial, as any lingering impurities would later degrade the parchment. You'd probably hold your breath a lot, if this was your assigned duty. After the lime bath, the softened, swollen skin was stretched tightly onto a wooden frame called a hearse. This frame was adjustable, with pegs or cords that allowed the skin to be pulled taut in all directions. Imagine stretching a giant, wet, hairy rubber band. As the skin dried under tension, the remaining hair and flesh were scraped off. This incredibly laborious process was done with a special curved knife, often with a blunt edge, called a lunellum, named for its crescent moon shape. The parchment maker would meticulously scrape both sides of the skin, first the hair side, then the flesh side, until it was perfectly clean and smooth. This step was essential for removing every last follicle and fiber, ensuring a uniform, pristine surface for writing. Any missed bits would show up as blemishes in the final product. It was literally skinning a skin to make it perfect. As the skin dried on the frame, it would be repeatedly scraped and stretched, thin and thinner, creating tension that rearranged the collagen fibers within the skin. This rearrangement is what gave parchment its remarkable strength, durability, and ability to hold ink without bleeding. The skin was often scraped until it was incredibly thin, sometimes translucent enough to see through, especially in the case of high-quality vellum. The thinner the parchment, the more elegant the manuscript, and the more valuable it became. After being thoroughly scraped and dried on the frame, the parchment was removed and often further processed. It might be sanded with pumice stone to achieve an even smoother surface, removing any lingering roughness. It could also be whitened with chalk powder, rubbed into the surface to absorb any oils and give it a brighter, more uniform appearance. This final preparation was all about achieving the perfect writing surface, smooth, non-absorbent, and resilient. You might notice that one side of the parchment, the hair side, often appears slightly darker or has a faint texture, while the flesh side is usually lighter and smoother. Scribes would typically arrange their quires folded sets of pages so that hair sides faced hair sides and flesh sides faced flesh sides. This ensured a more consistent appearance throughout the finished book. It's a small detail, but one that highlights the meticulous attention paid to every aspect of manuscript production. The sheer volume of skins required for a single book could be astonishing. A large Bible, for instance, might require hundreds of calfskins. Consider the logistics. Where did these animals come from? How were they processed? It points to a sophisticated network of supply, even in an era often characterized by localism. Historians still argue about the precise economic models that supported parchment production, whether monasteries raised their own animals specifically for skins, or if they relied on professional parchment makers and butchers. It was likely a mix, depending on the monastery's size and resources. The cost of parchment was immense. It represented a significant portion of the overall expense of producing a manuscript, often far outstripping the cost of ink or even the scribe's unpaid labor. This high cost is why medieval scribes developed techniques to conserve space, often using abbreviations and writing in dense, compact scripts. Every inch of that precious surface needed to be utilized. It's the ultimate lesson in not wasting paper, or rather, skin. Imagine the satisfaction, then, of finally receiving a stack of these perfectly prepared sheets. They might have a faint, almost leathery scent, and a unique feel, smooth, yet firm. Each sheet represents hours of labor, from the animal's life to the final scraping and smoothing. You handle them with immense care, knowing that any mistake could mean wasting a valuable resource. It's why scribes were so diligent, so meticulous. They weren't just dealing with abstract ideas, but with tangible, costly materials. One quirky tidbit about parchment: sometimes, due to scarcity or extreme cost, old manuscripts that were no longer considered important would be scraped clean and reused. These are called palimpsests. While the original text was painstakingly removed, faint traces of it can sometimes still be seen beneath the newer writing, offering a ghostly glimpse into lost knowledge. Modern technology, like UV light, can often reveal these hidden layers, making them a treasure trove for scholars. It's like finding a secret message beneath a shopping list. The physical act of preparing the parchment also had a direct impact on the scribe's work. Unevenness in the surface, subtle variations in thickness, or even tiny imperfections could make the quill drag, the ink bleed, or the lines appear crooked. A good scribe learned to work with the material, adapting their pressure and technique to compensate for its natural inconsistencies. It was a constant negotiation between the ideal and the reality of the organic surface. So, as you take a fresh sheet of parchment onto your carrel, you don't just see a blank page. You see the culmination of a long, involved process. You feel its smooth, cool surface, perhaps detect its faint. This isn't just where you'll write. This is a piece of history, carefully prepared, waiting to be filled with the words that will carry knowledge forward through the centuries. And knowing all that, the silence of the scriptorium feels even more profound, almost reverent, as you prepare to add your mark to this ancient, living canvas. With your meticulously prepared parchment laid out before you, the next crucial element enters the scene: ink and pigments. Forget your sleek, mass-produced cartridges. In the medieval scriptorium, every drop of color was a handcrafted marvel, often derived from surprising natural sources and requiring patience, skill, and a good deal of elbow grease to prepare. You're about to delve into the surprisingly earthy, sometimes pungent, world of medieval color making. Let's start with the workhorse of the scriptorium: black ink. For centuries, the predominant black ink was iron gall ink. Its recipe sounds less like a trip to the art supply store and more like a potion from an ancient text. The primary ingredient was oak galls, those strange, spherical growths you sometimes see on oak trees. These are not part of the tree itself, but abnormal swellings caused by the larvae of gall wasps, which lay their eggs in the oak buds. The galls are rich in tannins, complex organic compounds that react with iron to prepare them. The galls were collected, dried, and then crushed into a fine powder. This powder was then steeped in water or wine, allowing the tannins to leach out to this tannin-rich liquid. Ferrous sulfate, also known as vitriol, a form of iron salt, was added. This is where the magic happened. The tannins reacted with the iron, forming a deep, dark precipitate. To prevent this precipitate from simply settling to the bottom and making the ink chunky, a binder was essential. The most common binder was gum arabic, a natural resin harvested from acacia trees. It would be dissolved in the mixture, acting as a suspension agent and giving the ink its viscosity, allowing it to flow smoothly from the quill and adhere to the parchment. Sometimes a little bit of honey or egg white might also be added to improve flow or gloss. The ink wasn't immediately black. When first applied, iron gall ink often appeared a grayish blue or greenish black. It was only as it dried and oxidized on the parchment, reacting with the air over hours, days, and even centuries, that it would deepen to the rich, permanent, deep black we see in old manuscripts. This oxidizing property is also why, sometimes, you'll find ancient texts where the ink has actually eaten through the parchment in places the iron salts were slightly acidic and over vast stretches of time could degrade the very material they were written on. It's a testament to the ink's aggressive permanence. Imagine your printer ink slowly eating away at your paper. Now that's a commitment to durability. Now, for the splashes of vibrancy, red ink. This was crucial for rubrics, headings, initial letters, or important sections that needed to stand out. The word rubric itself comes from the Latin ruber, meaning red. There were several sources for red. One of the most common and vibrant was cinnabar, a mineral form of mercury sulfide. Grinding cinnabar into a fine powder produced a brilliant vermilion hue. However, working with cinnabar was dangerous. Mercury compounds are toxic, and prolonged exposure could lead to serious health issues. Medieval scribes likely didn't understand the chemistry, but they might have experienced the symptoms. Another red pigment was red lead, produced by roasting white lead, another toxic compound in a furnace. This produced a less vibrant, more orange-red color. For more organic reds, dyes from plants like madder root, or even insects like kermes or cochineal, tiny scale insects, could be used. These would be processed to extract the pigment, then mixed with a binder to create a paint-like consistency. The cochineal, in particular, yielded a magnificent crimson, so deep and rich it almost glowed. Blue pigments were highly prized and often the most expensive. The ultimate blue was ultramarine, derived from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone imported from Afghanistan. Lapis lazuli was incredibly costly due to its rarity and the immense effort required to mine and transport it across vast distances. To turn the stone into pigment, it had to be ground into an incredibly fine powder, then painstakingly separated from its impurities. This was a long, arduous process, and the resulting pigment was reserved for the most important manuscripts and the most sacred figures, like the Virgin Mary, whose robes were almost always painted with this luminous blue. Imagine importing a rock from the other side of the world just to get a specific shade of blue. That's dedication to aesthetics. Less expensive blues came from minerals like azurite, a copper carbonate, or from plants like woad or indigo. These provided more muted, sometimes greenish-blue tones, and were more commonly used for less significant illustrations. Greens often came from malachite, another copper mineral, or from plant dyes. Yellows could be derived from orpiment, arsenic sulfide, also highly toxic, or from saffron, turmeric, or various yellow flowers. White pigment was typically made from lead white or from finely ground chalk. Brown could come from various earth pigments, ochres, or even from charred bone. The preparation of these pigments was a laborious process, often undertaken by the scribe themselves or by dedicated monastic artisans. It involved grinding the raw materials, minerals, plants, or insects into an incredibly fine powder using a mortar and pestle, often on a smooth stone slab. The finer the grind, the purer and more intense the color would be. After grinding, the dry pigment would be mixed with a binder. For illumination, the most common binder was egg yolk, making a type of tempera paint, sometimes mixed with a little water or vinegar. For inks, gum arabic was more common. The consistency had to be just right, thick enough to hold its color, but thin enough to flow smoothly from a brush or a quill. Too thin, and it would look watery. Too thick, and it would clump. It was a constant balancing act, a subtle art in itself. You would have small, shell-shaped dishes or shallow pots for holding your mixed pigments. You'd dip your fine squirrel hair brushes into these, carefully loading them with color. The application required an incredibly steady hand and an almost microscopic level of detail, especially for the intricate patterns and tiny figures within the illuminated initials and miniatures. One quirky medieval tip for preparing blue pigments. From azurite, some recipes suggested adding a tiny amount of urine to the mixture to enhance the color. While it sounds rather unappetizing, the ammonia in the urine could sometimes help to deepen the blue hue. This just goes to show that medieval chemistry was often more practical than pleasant. Historians still debate the precise techniques and secret recipes used for some of the most vibrant and stable medieval pigments. Many of these formulas were closely guarded secrets, passed down through generations of monastic artists or professional illuminators. The loss of some of these techniques after the decline of monasteries meant that certain colors or effects were difficult, if not impossible, to replicate for centuries. The act of preparing these inks and pigments was deeply integrated into the monastic day. It wasn't merely a mechanical task. It was a form of meditation, a repetitive, focused activity that allowed the mind to settle and contemplate. As you ground the lapis lazuli or stirred the iron gall mixture, you were connecting with ancient traditions, with the very earth itself, transforming raw materials into vehicles for sacred knowledge and artistic expression. The smell of the scriptorium, then, wasn't just old parchment. It was a subtle blend of earth, minerals, and perhaps the faint, acrid temps of newly prepared ink. It was the scent of creation, of knowledge being brought forth from the raw elements of the world. And as you finished preparing your various pots of color, the vibrant reds, deep blues, and rich blacks sitting ready on your carrel, you felt a surge of quiet anticipation. The canvas was ready, the tools were sharp, and now the very essence of color, painstakingly prepared, awaited your hand to bring the words and images to life. It's a lot more involved than just clicking print. With your parchment smooth and clean, your quills sharpened, and your inks and pigments lovingly prepared, you're finally ready to truly begin the work that defines the scriptorium, the art of illumination. This is where the medieval manuscript transcends mere text and becomes a breathtaking work of art, a vibrant tapestry of color and gold that complements and enhances the sacred words it contains. This isn't just doodling, this is painting with devotion. Illumination refers to the embellishment of a manuscript with decorative elements, particularly initial letters, historiated or inhabited initials, borders, and miniature paintings. The term illumination itself comes from the Latin illuminare, meaning to light up, referring to the use of gold and silver that literally made the pages glow. You quickly learn that an illuminated manuscript was not just read, it was admired, revered, almost worshipped in its own right. The process often began before a single word of the main text was even copied. For important manuscripts, a design plan would be laid out. This involved not just deciding where the text would go, but also where the major initials would be placed, where miniature scenes would illustrate the narrative, and how intricate the border decorations would be. Sometimes, a rough sketch of the design might be lightly drawn on the parchment in lead point or with a stylus guiding the illuminator. This preliminary work was crucial. A mistake here could throw off the entire layout. It's like planning your entire website's visual design before writing a single line of code. The first step in applying the truly dazzling elements, particularly gold, was to prepare the surface. For raised gold, a special adhesive called gesso was used. This wasn't the gesso used by painters today. Medieval gesso was a thick, plaster-like mixture made from gypsum, chalk, lead white, and various glues, sometimes even incorporating honey or sugar for flexibility. It would be applied in a raised layer where the gold was intended to go, allowed to dry, and then carefully shaped and smoothed. This raised base would give the gold a three-dimensional quality, catching the light and making it appear to float above the page. Once the gesso was ready, the gold leaf would be applied. This was an unbelievably delicate material, sheets of pure gold, hammered so thin they were almost transparent, thinner than a human hair. Handling it required immense skill, and a steady hand, as a single breath could cause it to crinkle or float away. The illuminator would carefully lay the gold leaf onto the still tacky gesso, sometimes using a gilder's tip, a flat, soft brush, to pick it up. Once placed, it would be gently pressed down to adhere. Then came the magic, burnishing, with a smooth, polished stone, often an agate burnisher. The illuminator would gently rub the gold leaf, pressing it firmly onto the gesso and polishing it to a brilliant, mirror-like shine. This process brought out the full luster of the gold, making it shimmer and glow, truly illuminating the page. The contrast between the matte parchment and the gleaming gold was simply stunning. It's like watching a dull piece of metal suddenly transform into pure light. After the gold was laid and burnished, the application of pigments began. This was done with incredibly fine brushes, often made from squirrel hair, which could hold a point and allow for minute details. The process usually started with lighter colors, building up layers to create depth and shading. You'd carefully mix your powdered pigments with your binder, often egg yolk, on a palette, sometimes a simple piece of ceramic or shell. The consistency had to be perfect, to dry, and it wouldn't flow, to wet, and it would bleed. The illuminator's palette was a rainbow of colors, each with its unique properties and challenges. As we touched on earlier, ultramarine blue from lapis lazuli was incredibly precious, reserved for the most significant figures. Vermilion reds, malachite greens, and various earthy ochres filled out the spectrum. Every brushstroke was deliberate, every color carefully chosen for its symbolic meaning as much as its aesthetic appeal. For instance, blue was often associated with heaven and divinity, red with Christ's blood or martyrdom, and green with life and resurrection. The subjects of illumination varied widely. Initial letters were often the most common decorative elements. These might be merely ornamental, filled with intricate knotwork or patterns, or they could be historiated, meaning they contained miniature scenes directly related to the text, often depicting a biblical event or the life of a saint. Imagine the letter I containing a tiny depiction of the Last Supper, perfectly rendered within its narrow confines. Miniatures were standalone illustrations, often full-page or half-page, serving as visual narratives for the text. These could depict biblical stories, scenes from daily life, portraits of saints, or even fantastical creatures. The level of detail in these miniatures is astounding, given the tools available: faces, drapery, landscapes, all rendered with incredible precision, often using techniques that mimic the look of larger panel paintings. Borders also offered ample opportunity for decoration. These could be simple bands of color or elaborate floral designs, sometimes populated with whimsical figures known as drolleries or marginalia. As we mentioned, these quirky, often humorous doodles, a knight fighting a snail, a monkey playing bagpipes, a fantastical beast with human legs, offer a fascinating glimpse into the less serious side of monastic life. Historians still argue about the precise meaning or purpose of these drolleries. Were they simply humorous escapes from tedious work, inside jokes among scribes, or perhaps even symbolic commentaries on the text? Whatever their meaning, they add a charming, often unexpected, element of humanity to these sacred tomes. The process of illumination required immense patience. It wasn't uncommon for an illuminator to work on a single page for weeks, perfecting every tiny detail. The work was slow, meticulous, and demanded perfect concentration. Imagine trying to paint something the size of your thumbnail with a brush made of 3 hairs for hours on end without blinking. The scriptorium might have dedicated or scribes themselves might also be trained in the art. In larger, wealthier monasteries, there could be a distinct division of labor, with specialist scribes for the text and specialist artists for the decoration. In smaller houses, one monk might perform all these roles. This specialization, or lack thereof, would greatly impact the overall production, time, and the artistic quality of the final manuscript. One quirky tidbit: some medieval recipes for pigments included rather bizarre ingredients, like oxgall bile from an ox mixed into certain colors, believed to improve their flow or vibrancy. It's a testament to the empirical, often trial-and-error nature of medieval chemistry, where effective results sometimes trumped pleasant ingredients. The role of light was, of course, paramount. Illuminators needed the best possible natural light, so their carrels were often positioned closest to the windows. As evening drew in, working by the flickering, smoky light of a candle or oil lamp became even more challenging for such delicate work. The fine lines, the subtle shading, the minute details, all demanded consistent illumination. It makes you realize why they probably went to bed so early. The overall impact of illumination was profound. It transformed a book from a mere collection of words. The vibrant colors and shimmering gold didn't just adorn the text. They enhanced its meaning, drawing the eye, guiding the reader, and creating a sense of awe and reverence. An illuminated manuscript was a statement of faith, of wealth, and of the profound value placed on the written word. It was a fusion of artistry and piety, created under conditions of quiet dedication. And as you put down your brush, your eyes tired, but your heart perhaps full of quiet satisfaction, you realize you've brought a piece of history and a piece of sacred beauty to life, one tiny, glowing detail at a time. With the parchment prepared and the inks and pigments ready, you finally embark on the core task of your monastic life, copying the text itself. This is not a fast process. This is not a casual read-through. This is a meticulous letter-by-letter, word-by-word transcription, demanding an unwavering focus that would make modern multitasking seem utterly chaotic. You are a human printing press, operating at an incredibly, almost comically, slow speed. Your workspace, your carrel, is set up for maximum efficiency in a very medieval sense. On one side, you have the exemplar, the master copy or original manuscript you are copying from. This might be a precious ancient text, a recently acquired scholarly work, or, most commonly, a sacred scripture, like a gospel book or a psalter. The exemplar is often propped up on a small stand, or sometimes simply laid flat beside your working sheet of parchment. On the other side, or directly in front of you, is your fresh, ruled sheet of parchment, waiting patiently for your hand. Before you even begin writing, you might take a moment to resharpen your quill. A good, sharp point is crucial for crisp, clean lines. You dip the quill into your pot of black iron gall ink, carefully wiping any excess on the lip of the pot or a piece of scrap parchment to prevent drips. The first stroke on the pristine page is always a moment of quiet solemnity. You begin to transcribe slowly, methodically. Your eyes dart between the exemplar and your own page. You are not reading for comprehension in the modern sense. You are reading for accuracy, for the exact shape of each letter, the precise spacing between words, the correct punctuation or lack thereof, as medieval punctuation could be rather erratic by today's standards. Each stroke of the quill is deliberate, each letter a small, perfectly formed drawing. You might whisper the words to yourself, a soft murmur barely audible in the quiet of the scriptorium to aid in concentration and prevent skipping lines. This is a common technique, almost a vocalization of the physical act of writing. The script you are using is likely a form of Carolingian minuscule, or perhaps a regional variation like Gothic script textura, depending on your era and location. Carolingian minuscule, developed during Charlemagne's reign, was remarkably clear and legible, a stark contrast to some of the dense, almost indecipherable scripts that preceded it. Gothic script, popular later in the High Middle Ages, was more angular, compressed, and often highly abbreviated, allowing more text to fit on a precious sheet of parchment. Learning these scripts and maintaining consistency was a major part of your training. Imagine having to perfectly mimic someone else's handwriting for hours, every single day. One of the most challenging aspects of copying is maintaining perfect consistency, not just within a single page, but across an entire manuscript, and even from one manuscript to the next. The height of the letters, the spacing of the lines, the width of the margins, all had to be uniform. This required constant vigilance and an incredible sense of discipline. A slight deviation in line height might make an entire page look uneven. It's like being a robot programmed for perfect calligraphy, but you're also a human who gets tired and cold as you write. Your body adopts a specific posture. Hunching over the sloped carrel is common. Your back aching, your neck stiff, your writing hand cramps, and you learn to periodically flex your fingers and stretch your wrist to prevent debilitating stiffness. The light, whether natural or from a candle, is often insufficient, forcing you to squint, straining your eyes. Many scribes would have suffered from poor eyesight later in life, a silent occupational hazard. The pace is slow, painfully slow. A skilled scribe might complete 2 to 4 pages of text in a day, perhaps more if the script was simple and the day long. Copying an entire Bible, even with multiple scribes working concurrently, could take months or even years. This is why medieval books were so incredibly rare and valuable, not just for their content, but for the sheer labor embodied in every single page. Think about how long it takes to print a modern book. Now imagine doing it all by hand, with a feather. Mistakes are inevitable, even for the most careful scribe. A skipped word, a repeated line, a misspelled name. The medieval scriptorium had its own methods for correction, far removed from our digital undo button. For small errors, you might use a scraper, a small, sharp knife, to carefully scrape away the top layer of parchment where the ink had dried, then rewrite the correction. This had to be done with extreme delicacy to avoid tearing the precious parchment. For larger errors, or if scraping wasn't feasible, you might put a tiny dot beneath the mistake and write the correction in the margin, or even use a small symbol to indicate a word should be inserted. Sometimes, if the error was too egregious, an entire sheet of parchment might be discarded, a costly mistake. Historians still argue about the precise frequency and types of errors in medieval manuscripts, and how much creative license some scribes might have taken. One quirky tidbit about copying: some scribes would add a colophon at the end of their work. This was a brief note where they might record the date, their name, the circumstances of the copying, or even add a personal comment. Some colophons are quite charming, expressing relief at finishing a long project. Thanks be to God, I have finished this book. Or even complaining about the cold, the bad ink, or the difficulty of the exemplar, a curse upon the scribe who writes badly, and a blessing upon the one who corrects it. These personal touches offer a wonderful human glimpse into the lives of these anonymous copyists. The silence in the scriptorium becomes a comfort, a necessary condition for such intense focus. Any noise, any distraction could lead to an error. You learn to block out the subtle sounds of other monks at work, to focus solely on the rhythm of your quill and the words unfolding beneath your hand. The scent of parchment and ink, the cool air, the steady, rhythmic breathing of your fellow scribes, these become the background hum of your existence. As you progress through the text, you begin to develop a profound connection with the words, even if you are simply copying, without deep theological or philosophical contemplation at every moment. The sheer act of transcribing imbues the text with a new kind of meaning. You are not just a copyist, you are a conduit, which ancient wisdom flows, ensuring its survival for future generations. There's a subtle spirituality in that, a quiet understanding of your role in the vast chain of knowledge transmission. The discipline of copying extends beyond mere handwriting. You learn to recognize and reproduce various abbreviations and ligatures, joined letters common in medieval scripts, These were used to save space on expensive parchment and speed up the copying process. For example, ET and might be represented by an ampersand-like symbol, or per by a P with a stroke through it. Mastering these abbreviations was essential for both writing and reading medieval texts. It was like learning a whole new shorthand. Without the convenience of a keyboard, the work is monotonous, yes, but it is also deeply satisfying. Each completed line, each finished page, represents progress. As the pile of copied sheets grows, you feel a sense of quiet accomplishment. You are creating something beautiful, something enduring, something that will outlive you and continue to share its wisdom with those who come after. It's a bit like building a very, very slow Lego set, where each brick is a perfectly formed letter. Your concentration rarely wavers, even as the day progresses. When the light begins to dim, the precious candles or oil lamps are lit, casting a warm, flickering glow over your carrel. Working by this dim, dancing light requires even greater concentration, your eyes straining to decipher the words of the exemplar and perfectly form your own. The shadows lengthen, the scriptorium becomes even more hushed, and the scratching of quills seems louder in the deepening stillness. This is the heart of your work, often continuing late into the night until the final bells for Compline signal. The end of the day's labor and the beginning of the grand silence. You put down your quill, stretch your aching fingers, and retreat to your humble bed. The phantom shapes of letters still dancing behind your eyelids. Even for the most meticulous scribe, working in the dim light of a medieval scriptorium, with rudimentary tools and the relentless pressure of consistency, errors were an inevitable part of the copying process. But unlike your modern delete button or digital spell check, correcting a mistake in a medieval manuscript was a delicate, painstaking, and often quite visible affair. You're about to discover why medieval books sometimes bear the scars of their creation. Imagine you're deep in concentration, perhaps transcribing a complex theological treatise or a lengthy biblical passage. Your quill is gliding smoothly across the parchment, ink flowing perfectly, and then, gasp, your eye skips a line, or you misspell a word, or you accidentally repeat a phrase. Your heart might do a tiny medieval flutter, because you know this isn't a quick fix for a small, fresh error, perhaps a stray ink blot, or a single misspelled letter that hasn't fully dried. The scribe might quickly and gently blot it with a piece of clean linen or a sponge. This would prevent the ink from soaking too deeply into the parchment. But if the ink had already set, a more drastic measure was needed: the scraper. This was a small, very sharp knife, often with a finely ground edge, with incredible precision. The scribe would carefully scrape away the top layer of the parchment where the ink lay, effectively erasing the error. This was a true test of skill. Scrape too lightly, and the ink remains. Scrape too heavily, and you risk tearing a hole in the precious parchment, or creating a thin, rough spot that would bleed if rewritten upon. It's like trying to remove a stain from a delicate fabric without damaging the fibers. But if the fabric costs as much as a small farm, once the scraping was done, the surface might be gently rubbed with a smooth stone or a piece of bone to re-smooth the fibers, making it as receptive to new ink as possible. Then, with a fresh dip of the quill, the correct letter or word would be painstakingly rewritten in the now bare patch of parchment. Often, if you examine medieval manuscripts closely, you can still see these faint, scraped areas, almost like ghosts of errors past. For larger errors, like an entire word or phrase needing correction, or if scraping was deemed too risky, other methods were employed. One common approach was erasure by omission. The scribe would simply skip the erroneous word or phrase and continue writing, hoping a future reader or corrector wouldn't notice. This, of course, led to inconsistencies between copies. Another method was to underline the incorrect word or phrase with dots or a thin line, effectively crossing it out, and then writing the correct text in the margin, with a small symbol like a caret or an asterisk to indicate where it should be inserted. This was a visible but non-destructive way of making corrections. Sometimes a tiny, almost invisible X might be placed next to a word that was to be ignored. If an entire line or a larger section was accidentally omitted, the scribe might write the missing text in the margin, often in a smaller hand, and then draw a line or a symbol to direct the reader to where it should be placed in the main body of the text. Imagine reading a book where chunks of text are just floating in the margins with little arrows pointing vaguely inwards. It would be less than ideal for flow. Sometimes errors were so fundamental that an entire choir, a folded gathering of parchment sheets that forms a section of a book, or even a complete sheet of parchment, had to be discarded. Given the immense value and labor involved in producing parchment, this was a costly mistake, a truly cringeworthy moment for any scribe. You wouldn't just crumple it up and throw it in the bin. You'd probably have to explain yourself to the abbot. The role of the corrector was also vital. In larger scriptoria, particularly in later periods, a dedicated monk or a senior scribe would review the work of others. This corrector would diligently compare the new copy against the exemplar, marking errors with specific symbols. They might also add marginal notes, indicate omissions, or even, in some cases, make stylistic changes or update language to contemporary usage. This was essentially the medieval version of quality control, ensuring the text was as accurate as possible. Before the laborious process of binding, historians still argue about the precise authority and freedom that correctors had, and whether their interventions always improved the text or sometimes introduced new errors. A peculiar type of error, often found in medieval manuscripts, is the so-do meme, literally, jump from the same to the same. This occurs when a scribe's eye jumps from one word or phrase to an identical or very similar one further down the page, accidentally omitting the text in between. It's a common human error when copying long texts, and it perfectly illustrates the mental strain of the work. You're so focused on the precise shape of the letters that your brain occasionally tries to take a shortcut, with unfortunate results. The presence of errors in medieval manuscripts is not a sign of sloppiness, but rather a testament to the human element involved in their creation. Each manuscript, even when copying the same text, is unique, bearing the subtle marks of the scribe's hand, their occasional wariness, or their momentary lapse in concentration. These imperfections, far from detracting from the beauty of the book, often add to its charm and provide invaluable insights into medieval scribal practices. It's a bit like a hand-knitted sweater, having a dropped stitch here or there. It shows it's handmade, not mass-produced. Another fascinating aspect of medieval correction involved the concept of improvement. Sometimes a scribe might encounter a passage in the exemplar that they believed was incorrect, unclear, or simply could be phrased better. They might then, on their own initiative or under instruction, correct it to what they perceived as a more accurate or elegant reading. While this preserved some texts, it also led to textual variants and sometimes introduced new errors if the scribe's judgment was flawed. This is why modern textual criticism often involves comparing dozens, even hundreds, of medieval copies to try and reconstruct the original text as accurately as possible. The importance of accuracy was paramount, especially for sacred texts. Imagine copying the Bible and accidentally changing a key theological point. While not always perfectly achieved, the ideal was flawless reproduction. This wasn't just about intellectual integrity. It was about spiritual integrity. The words themselves were considered sacred, and their accurate transmission was a devotional act. So, as you work, you become intimately familiar with the feeling of a scraping knife on parchment, the subtle difference in texture when you rewrite over a corrected area, and the small, almost imperceptible sigh of relief when you manage to fix a mistake without leaving an obvious blemish. It's a constant battle against human fallibility, waged one precise stroke at a time. The quiet of the scriptorium, then, is punctuated not just by the rhythmic scratch of quills, but by the occasional soft shik-shik of a scraper, a quiet testament to the enduring human struggle for perfection. And at the end of the day, as you look at your finished pages, you see not just words, but the history of their very creation, imperfections, and all quietly preserving knowledge in a world that often sought to lose it. After countless hours of meticulous copying, scraping, and illuminating, your stack of individual parchment sheets begins to resemble something substantial. But these are still just loose pages. The final magical transformation from a pile of processed animal skins to a sturdy, enduring book is achieved through the intricate craft of binding. This isn't just gluing pages together. It's a complex, multi-step process that ensures the book's longevity and protects its precious contents. You're about to see how a collection of pages becomes a physical object that could survive centuries. The first step in binding is to organize the individual sheets into quires, pronounced quires. A quire is a gathering of folded parchment sheets, typically 4 sheets folded in half to create 8 leaves or 16 pages. These quires are nested together, much like sections of a modern newspaper, and then carefully ordered. Scribes would often add a quire signature, a small letter or number, sometimes accompanied by a Roman numeral indicating the order of the leaves within that quire at the bottom of the last page of each quire. This almost invisible mark was crucial for the binder, ensuring all quires were assembled in the correct sequence. It's like a hidden instruction manual for future bookbinders. Once the quires are correctly ordered, they need to be prepared for sewing. This involves creating small holes along the fold of each quire through which the sewing thread will pass. These holes were precisely pricked, often with a specialized tool, to ensure even spacing and alignment. This painstaking attention to detail at every stage is what made medieval books so incredibly robust. Next comes the actual sewing. The quires are sewn onto horizontal supports called cords or bands. These cords, typically made of hemp or flax run across the spine of the book. The binder would use a strong linen thread, passing it through the holes in the quires and looping it around the cords, attaching each quire securely to the ones preceding and following it. This creates a flexible, yet incredibly strong, sewing structure. The number of cords varied, usually between 3 and 5, depending on the size of the book. This technique, known as long stitch binding or support sewing, is fundamental to medieval bookbinding and is still used in traditional binding today. It's a lot like knitting, but with much higher stakes and no Netflix in the background. Once all the quires are sewn together, you have the text block, the entire book, but still without covers. The ends of the cords, extending from the spine, are then fanned out. These will be laced into the wooden boards that form the covers. The covers themselves were typically made of wooden boards, usually oak or beech, cut to size and beveled along the edges. These boards were strong, durable, and offered excellent protection for the delicate parchment pages within. The fanned-out cords from the sewn text block would be threaded through holes drilled into these wooden boards, and then often pegged or wedged in place on the inside of the board. This creates an incredibly strong mechanical attachment between the text block and the covers, a bond that could last for centuries. It's an engineering marvel in its simplicity and effectiveness. Imagine trying to rip the cover off one of these. You'd probably pull your arm out of its socket first, with the text block and boards secured. The next step often involved covering the wooden boards. The most common covering material was leather, usually calfskin or pigskin, stretched tightly over the wooden boards and adhered with a strong hide glue. The leather might be left plain, or it could be decorated. Decoration could involve blind tooling, pressing designs into the leather with heated tools, creating an impression without color, or sometimes even applying metal fittings like clasps, bosses, raised metal studs, and corner pieces. These metal elements weren't just decorative. They provided extra protection, preventing the leather from wearing down and keeping the book slightly elevated from dusty surfaces for very valuable manuscripts, especially liturgical books used on altars. Even more elaborate decoration could be applied. This might include precious metals like silver or gold, jewels, ivory carvings, or even intricate enamel work embedded directly into the covers. These would have been incredibly heavy and opulent objects, designed to awe and inspire, signifying the immense spiritual and material wealth of the monastery or patron. Historians still argue about the precise craftsmanship involved in some of these highly decorated bindings. Whether all work was done within the monastery, or if specialist secular artisans were sometimes commissioned, it was likely a mix, depending on the specific skills available. Finally, clasps were often added. These were metal straps, usually leather-backed, that hooked onto pins on the opposing cover. Clasps served a crucial functional purpose. Parchment, being animal skin, is sensitive to changes in humidity. Without clasps to keep the book firmly shut, the pages could buckle, cockle, or warp, damaging the text and illustrations. The clasps ensured the book remained tightly closed, preventing the parchment from absorbing moisture and expanding. It's like a medieval dehumidifier, built right into the book. The process of binding was often performed in a separate bindery workshop within the monastery or by external professional bookbinders. It required specialized skills, tools, and a deep understanding of materials. The binder, in many ways, was the unsung hero of manuscript production, transforming the scribe's painstaking work into a resilient, usable object. You might notice the inbands, the decorative stitching at the top and bottom of the spine, usually in colored silk or linen. These aren't just for show. They provide extra strength to the spine, reinforcing the sewing at the vulnerable head and tail of the book and helping to maintain the book's shape. It's a small, beautiful detail that serves a very practical purpose. One quirky tidbit about medieval binding: some books, particularly larger ones, or those used in libraries, were fitted with chains. A metal chain would be attached to the book's cover, usually near the top edge, and then secured to a rod or lectern in the library. This was not a punishment for misbehaving books, but a necessary security measure to prevent theft in an age when books were incredibly valuable and rare. Imagine having to unlock a chain just to read a book. It makes those overdue library fines seem rather quaint. The time involved in binding a single book could vary greatly, from a few days for a simple manuscript, 2 weeks, or even months for a large, elaborately decorated one. It was the culmination of countless hours of labor from scribes, illuminators, and parchment makers, all brought together by the binder's skilled hands. When you hold a finished medieval book, you feel its weight, its solidity, the slight unevenness of the wooden boards beneath the leather, the satisfying click of the clasps as they lock into place, the way the pages fall open with a gentle rustle. All these sensory details connect you directly to the hands that made it centuries ago. It's a testament to incredible patience and dedication. The durability of these bindings is astonishing. Many medieval books have survived for over 1,000 years, their wooden boards still intact, their sewing structures still holding firm. This longevity is a direct result of the robust materials and the ingenious techniques employed by medieval binders. They were built to last, to withstand the ravages of time, handling, and occasional clumsy monks. So, as the final clasps click into place on a newly bound volume, there's a quiet sense of triumph. The journey of this book, from animal skin to sacred text, is complete. It is now ready to serve its purpose, to be read, studied, prayed over, and preserved for generations. And as you place it carefully onto a shelf in the monastic library, you feel a deep connection to the countless others who have contributed to its creation, a silent continuity stretching back through time, all held together by thread, wood, and a remarkable amount of patience. With the final book bound and clasped, you carry it with reverence from the bindery to its ultimate resting place, the monastery library. This isn't the vast, public, brightly lit space you might imagine today. The medieval monastic library was a place of quiet, often austere, reverence, a treasure trove where knowledge was guarded as zealously as any precious jewel. You're about to discover a place where books were literally chained, and silence was the loudest sound as you enter. The library. The first thing that strikes you, again, is the profound quiet. It's a different kind of quiet from the scriptorium. Less about the sound of work, more about the hushed atmosphere of contemplation and preservation. The air is cool, often dry, a deliberate environmental choice to protect the delicate parchment from dampness and decay. You might catch the faint, unique scent of aged parchment, leather, and perhaps a subtle hint of beeswax from the candles used for illumination. The architecture of a medieval monastic library varied. In earlier periods, books might have been kept in chests or cupboards, perhaps in the cloister or a dedicated room off the church. As collections grew, more formal spaces emerged. These were often long, narrow rooms with high, arched windows designed to provide good, natural light, similar to the scriptorium. The emphasis was on security and preservation. The most distinctive feature you'll notice in many medieval libraries are the chained books. Yes, actual chains. These weren't for misbehaving books, but for very valuable ones. A metal chain, often several feet long, would be attached to the cover of a particularly important manuscript, typically a large Bible, a valuable theological text, or an encyclopedic work, and then secured to a rod or lectern. This allowed the book to be opened and read, but not removed from the library. It was the ultimate security system, predating alarm tags and RFID chips by centuries. Imagine trying to check out Harry Potter if it was chained to the shelf. You'd probably just read it. Standing up. Books were often stored on lectern desks, where they lay flat on their sides, rather than standing upright on shelves like modern books. This was because medieval books, especially the large, heavy ones, were not designed to stand upright on their spines for long periods, which could damage the binding. Sometimes these lecterns would also serve as reading desks, allowing a monk to consult a chained book right where it lay. Later, medieval libraries might have introduced more familiar bookshelves, but the concept of books lying flat was common. The collection itself would be surprisingly small by modern standards, but incredibly rich in content. The core of any library would be liturgical books, Bibles, psalters, missals, breviaries, the texts necessary for daily worship. Beyond these, you'd find a wealth of patristic writings, works by early church fathers like Augustine, Jerome, and Gregory the Great, theological commentaries, and sermons. These were the bedrock of monastic study and contemplation. But monastic libraries weren't solely spiritual. Many also contained classical texts from ancient Greece and Rome, works of philosophy, Aristotle, Plato, history, Livy, Caesar, rhetoric, Cicero, and even poetry, Virgil, Ovid. Without the diligent copying efforts of monks, many of these classical works would have been lost forever to the ravages of time and the decline of literacy. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, this is a mainstream historical fact. Medieval monasteries were crucial in preserving classical knowledge. During a period often called the Dark Ages in Europe, you might also find works on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, grammar, and law. Monasteries were often centers of learning, and their libraries reflected this intellectual breadth, even if the primary focus remained theological. Some libraries even had unique and esoteric texts, perhaps a rare illuminated bestiary, a book of real and mythical animals, or a peculiar treatise on alchemy. The variety could be surprisingly broad. Access to these precious books was often highly controlled. Not every monk had free rein of the library. Access might be restricted to senior monks, scholars, or those specifically engaged in copying. You, as a scribe, would have privileged access to the exemplars you needed to copy, but probably wouldn't be allowed to simply browse at will. The librarian, often a respected and knowledgeable monk, known as the armorius or custos was the guardian of this knowledge, responsible for cataloging maintaining and lending sparingly the books? Imagine being the gatekeeper to all knowledge, and your main job is to say no. The process of cataloging was rudimentary compared to modern systems. Books might be organized by subject, by size, or simply by the order in which they were acquired. Some libraries had rudimentary lists or inventories, often written on tablets or parchment scrolls, noting the contents of their collection. These early catalogs are invaluable resources for modern historians trying to understand medieval intellectual life. One quirky tidbit about medieval libraries: the concept of shelving books by topic was often quite flexible. Sometimes, books were placed near the windows where they could be read in the best light. Other times, they might be arranged to balance the weight on the shelves. It was often a practical arrangement rather than a strictly systematic one, leading to some unexpected neighbors on the shelves. Imagine finding a medical textbook next to a book on mythical creatures just because they fit. The importance of the monastic library cannot be overstated. In a world with no public libraries, no printing presses, and low literacy rates, these collections were vital repositories of knowledge. They were the intellectual powerhouses of the age, centers where learning could be preserved, cultivated, and disseminated. Without them, much of our understanding of both classical antiquity and the medieval period itself would be lost. Historians still debate the extent to which books were actually read versus merely preserved in some monastic libraries, particularly during earlier periods. While some monasteries were vibrant centers of scholarly activity, others may have been more focused on simply safeguarding texts rather than actively studying them. However, the sheer act of preservation, regardless of immediate active use, was itself an invaluable contribution to the continuity of knowledge. The silence in the library was not just about respecting the sacred texts, but also about facilitating contemplation. Reading was often done aloud, even when alone, as it aided comprehension in an age when most people were accustomed to oral communication. The quiet hum of a monk murmuring a passage to himself would have been a common sound. It's a reminder that reading was a very different sensory experience back then. As you place the newly bound book on its designated lectern, perhaps chaining it securely, you feel a profound sense of continuity. You are not just a copyist, you are a link in an unbroken chain, a guardian of the written word. This library, with its cool air, its faint scent of ancient parchment, and its silent, chained treasures, represents the enduring power of knowledge against the relentless march of time and forgetfulness. It is a sanctuary for ideas, a quiet bastion in a turbulent world. And as you step back, the soft rustle of your habit against the stone floor, the only sound, you know that this book and the countless others around it will quietly wait, preserving their secrets for centuries to come, illuminated not just by gold, but by the patient dedication of those who copied them by flickering candlelight. You've seen the meticulous process of copying, the delicate art of illumination, and the quiet dignity of the monastic library. But it would be a mistake to romanticize the life of a medieval scribe too much. Despite the profound spiritual rewards and the intellectual satisfaction, the daily reality of your work was often one of considerable challenges and hardships. This wasn't a cozy office job with ergonomic chairs and unlimited coffee. This was a physical and mental grind that would make most modern desk jobs feel like a spa day. Let's start with the most pervasive challenge, the cold. As you remember, from your first day, monastic buildings, especially scriptoria, were typically unheated or, at best, minimally warmed by a distant brazier if fire risk allowed. Stone walls, while sturdy, are excellent at retaining cold. You would work for hours in an environment where the temperature might barely rise above freezing in winter. Your fingers would ache, stiffen, and sometimes even become numb, making the precise work of holding a quill and forming tiny letters excruciatingly difficult. Imagine trying to write perfectly legible script while wearing gloves, which would be impractical for fine work, or with hands so cold they barely respond. It's like trying to thread a needle while submerged in ice water. This cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it affected the materials themselves. Ink could thicken, flowing poorly from the quill. Parchment could become brittle and stiff, making it harder to handle and more prone to cracking. Water-based pigments might freeze if left out too long. The scribe had to contend with these material challenges on top of their own physical discomfort. Then there's the light. While scriptoria were designed to maximize natural light, this was still medieval Europe, not a well-lit modern office. On cloudy days, in winter, or as evening approached, your primary light source would be the flickering, smoky glow of a beeswax candle or an oil lamp. This dim, often inconsistent illumination put immense strain on your eyes. Reading an exemplar and meticulously copying fine script for hours by this light would lead to severe eye strain, headaches, and, for many older scribes, premature deterioration of eyesight. You'd be constantly squinting, your eyes tired and burning. Forget blue light filters. Your only option was to literally go blind slowly. The physical posture required for copying was another source of hardship, hunching over a sloped carrel for many hours, with little opportunity for movement or stretching, would inevitably lead to chronic back pain, neck stiffness, and cramped hands and wrists. Imagine holding a single, precise position for 6 to 10 hours a day, every day, with no breaks for stretching or walking around. Your body would become a monument to musculoskeletal discomfort. Monastic life, while spiritually enriching, was not designed for physical comfort. The monotony of the work itself was a significant mental challenge. Copying text, word by word, letter by letter, for thousands of pages, is a repetitive task that demands unwavering concentration, but offers little in the way of intellectual stimulation beyond the words themselves. It's easy to lose focus, to become distracted, or to simply grow bored. This is precisely why monastic discipline, with its emphasis on spiritual contemplation and prayer, was so crucial. It provided a framework for maintaining mental acuity and purpose even amidst the dulling repetition. This is probably why some scribes started drawing bizarre marginalia. They needed some kind of mental escape. Errors and the pressure of perfection added another layer of stress. As we discussed, parchment was expensive and mistakes were costly. The need for absolute accuracy, especially in sacred texts, was paramount. A serious error could mean hours of painstaking scraping, or worse, the waste of an entire sheet of valuable parchment, something you would be keenly aware of. This constant pressure to be perfect, even under difficult conditions, would be a source of quiet anxiety. The diet in the monastery while sufficient to sustain life, was often bland and monotonous. Simple gruel, bread, vegetables, and occasional fish provided basic sustenance, but not much in the way of culinary delight. Meat was largely forbidden. This austere diet, combined with the cold and physical demands, meant that monks, while perhaps not starving, were rarely robustly healthy by modern standards. Lack of certain nutrients might have contributed to various ailments. Isolation was another factor. While you were part of a community, the monastic life, and especially the work of a scribe, involved significant periods of silence and solitude. You were cut off from the wider world, from family, from news, and from secular entertainment. For some, this was precisely the appeal, but for others, it could lead to feelings of loneliness or a sense of detachment. The grand silence, enforced for many hours of the day, further emphasized this isolation. Furthermore, disease and illness were ever-present threats in medieval times. Monasteries, while sometimes having infirmaries and herbal knowledge, were not immune to the plagues and common infections that swept through the population. A severe illness could easily put a scribe out of commission for weeks or even months, or worse. There were no antibiotics, no advanced medical care, just prayer, herbal remedies, and perhaps a bit of quiet suffering. Historians still argue about the true average lifespan and health of medieval monks compared to the general population. While monastic life offered some protection from violence and provided basic sustenance, the rigorous schedule, austere diet, and difficult working conditions likely took their toll. However, the monastic emphasis on cleanliness, regular routine, and the availability of some care might have offered advantages over the average medieval peasant's existence. It's a complex picture. Despite all these hardships, many scribes performed their duties with remarkable dedication. Their motivations were often deeply spiritual. The act of copying was seen as a form of prayer, a way to glorify God and to ensure the transmission of sacred knowledge. The belief that they were contributing to something larger than themselves, preserving wisdom for future generations, provided immense purpose and meaning that transcended the physical discomforts. It's a bit like running a marathon, but the finish line is 1,000 years away. One quirky tidbit: some monastic rules even prescribed specific ways for monks to complain about their difficulties, often requiring them to do so in silence, through gestures, or by writing their grievance on a slate. Imagine having to mime your frustrations about cold fingers or an aching back. It was a complaint system designed for maximal inconvenience. The endurance of these monks, their sheer grit in the face of such relentless challenges, is truly remarkable. They worked not for fame or fortune. They had taken vows of poverty, after all, but for faith, for knowledge, and for the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Each perfectly formed letter, each illuminated initial, each bound volume, represents not just hours of labor, but also hours of quiet suffering, cold hands, aching backs, and strained eyes. So, as you lay down your quill at the end of another long, cold day, your fingers stiff and your eyes weary, you understand the true cost of each word, each page, each book. It's a cost measured not in currency, but in personal discomfort, unwavering discipline, and profound dedication. Yet, there's also a quiet pride, a deep sense of accomplishment. You are a guardian of light in an often dark world, ensuring that the flickering flame of knowledge, painstakingly copied by candlelight, continues to burn brightly for centuries to come. Having spent your days diligently copying texts, you also become acutely aware of a pervasive tragedy: lost knowledge. For every manuscript you painstakingly preserve, countless others simply vanished from existence, swallowed by the relentless currents of time, war, neglect, or simply the fragility of parchment itself. You're about to ponder the ghostly silence of texts that are no longer with us, leaving tantalizing gaps in our understanding of history. Imagine a grand library, perhaps in Alexandria, or a rich collection in a Roman villa, teeming with scrolls and codices. Now imagine it consumed by fire, scattered by invaders, or simply left to rot in damp conditions. That was the fate of untold numbers of ancient and medieval texts. While monasteries were vital safe havens for books, they were not impervious to these destructive forces. A Viking raid could torch an entire abbey, reducing centuries of accumulated wisdom to ash in a single afternoon. A fire, started accidentally by a dropped candle in a scriptorium, could consume irreplaceable works. Even simple neglect, dampness, or infestations of rodents and insects could slowly degrade and destroy parchment. It's like having a hard drive filled with irreplaceable data, and then just leaving it in a leaky basement for a few centuries. One of the most profound losses came from the decline of literacy and the shift in focus after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. While monastic scriptoria eventually became centers of learning, there was a period where much of the classical knowledge became less relevant or accessible to the new, largely illiterate populations. Texts that didn't fit the emerging Christian worldview, or those deemed too pagan, were often simply not copied. If a text wasn't recopied regularly, it would eventually decay, its parchment breaking down, its ink fading until it simply ceased to exist. Think of all the obscure Roman comedies or philosophical treatises that probably just crumbled into dust because no one thought they were worth the immense effort of copying. The sheer volume of material that never made it to us is staggering. We have fragments, tantalizing references in other texts, or simply titles on ancient lists, hinting at a vast literary landscape that is now gone. For instance, consider the many lost plays of ancient Greek tragedians, like Aeschylus or Sophocles. We only have a fraction of their complete works, or the countless historical accounts, scientific treatises, and philosophical debates that simply didn't survive. The transition from papyrus scrolls, which are much less durable than parchment, to parchment codices, or through the turbulent early medieval centuries. This leads to significant gaps in our understanding of medieval life itself. We often piece together knowledge from surviving tax records, legal documents, and chronicles. But imagine how much more we would know if all the letters, daily journals, or specialized craft manuals of the era had survived. Historians still argue about the precise content of some lost works, trying to reconstruct them from references in other texts. It's like trying to rebuild a jigsaw puzzle when half the pieces are missing, and you don't even have the picture on the box. The choices made by scribes and monastic communities, often unconsciously, also shaped what survived. If a particular text was deemed important, religiously significant, or highly sought after, it was copied again and again, increasing its chances of survival. But if a text was obscure, controversial, or simply not deemed useful, it might only exist in one or two copies, making it incredibly vulnerable. The very act of copying, while preservative, was also a selective filter. A particularly poignant example of lost knowledge lies in the concept of palimpsests, which we touched on briefly. These are parchment manuscripts where the original text has been scraped or washed away to make room for new writing. This was often done out of necessity due to the extreme expense and scarcity of parchment. While it saved materials, it also meant that unique, often valuable, older texts were sometimes deliberately erased to make way for new ones, usually more contemporary religious works. Modern imaging techniques, like UV light or multispectral imaging, have revealed some incredible hidden texts beneath these later layers, giving us tantalizing glimpses of what was lost, but much remains illegible or utterly destroyed. It's a bit like finding an ancient masterpiece painted over with a grocery list. Think about the everyday practical knowledge that has been lost, specific agricultural techniques, forgotten herbal remedies, peculiar craft methods, or even unique architectural designs that were never formally recorded and simply died out with their practitioners. Much of medieval knowledge was transmitted orally or through apprenticeship rather than written down, making it extremely vulnerable to disruption. One quirky example of a possible lost text, though purely speculative, is the mythical book of Thoth from ancient Egypt, believed to contain secrets of the gods and universe. While it's largely a legend, it highlights humanity's perennial fascination with lost, powerful knowledge. In a more historical context, numerous medical treatises from ancient Greece and Rome are known only by title or brief citation, their contents now forever inaccessible. The role of the scribe then takes on an even greater significance when viewed through this lens of loss. Every stroke of your quill, every painstakingly copied page, is a defiant act against oblivion. You are a bulwark against the tide of forgetting, ensuring that at least some fragments of the past endure. It's a lonely, quiet battle, often unrecognized by the outside world, but profoundly important. Historians still argue about the exact proportion of ancient and medieval texts that have been lost, with estimates ranging widely. What is clear is that the surviving corpus of knowledge is but a shadow of what once existed. Every surviving manuscript is thus a precious survivor, a testament not just to its content, but to the unlikely chain of events and dedicated labor that allowed it to reach us. As you sit in the scriptorium, the quiet hum of your own breathing and the occasional rustle of parchment your only companions. You might ponder the fragility of the written word, the candle flame so vital for your work in the dim light is also a constant reminder of the ever-present threat of fire. The cold, that constant companion, hints at the damp and decay that could ruin centuries of effort. Your work is not just about bringing new books into existence. It is about keeping old ones alive, about fighting a quiet, relentless war against the forces that would erase the past. And in that, there is a profound, albeit somber, sense of purpose. The knowledge you preserve, sometimes obscure, sometimes mundane, sometimes sacred, is a beacon against the darkness of ignorance. And even as you diligently copy, knowing that countless other words have perished, you take solace in the fact that, for this moment, under the flickering candlelight. These words, at least, are safe. While the scriptorium was undoubtedly the intellectual heart of the monastery, and your primary focus as a scribe, the impact of monastic life and its emphasis on literacy stretched far beyond the scriptorium walls. Monasteries weren't just quiet havens for bookworms. They were often dynamic centers that subtly, yet profoundly, influenced the wider medieval world. You're about to explore the ripple effect of monastic learning. One of the most significant ways monastic literacy impacted the wider world was through education. While formal schooling was rare and largely inaccessible to the general population, monasteries often provided the only real centers of education in many regions. Boys, typically from noble families or those destined for the clergy, might be sent to a monastic school, an oblate system for those who would become monks, or a schola exterior for those who would not. Here, they would learn Latin, grammar, rhetoric, and basic arithmetic, the foundational subjects of the medieval curriculum, known as the trivium and quadrivium. You might have even spent time teaching younger novices the basics of reading and writing, perhaps correcting their clumsy attempts at forming letters. This wasn't just about training future monks. It was about preserving a literate class in a largely illiterate society. Beyond formal schooling, monasteries served as repositories of practical knowledge. Many monks were not just scribes, but also skilled agriculturalists, architects, physicians, and craftsmen. They meticulously copied texts on farming techniques, herbal medicine, construction, and even engineering, preserving and sometimes expanding upon this knowledge. For example, the detailed medieval treatises on irrigation or crop rotation found in monastic libraries weren't just theoretical. They were applied in the monastery's own fields, often making monastic estates highly productive and serving as models for surrounding communities. Consider the role of monastic physicians. While medieval medicine might seem rudimentary by today's standards, monastic infirmaries often contained the most advanced medical knowledge available, derived from classical Greek and Roman texts that had been carefully copied and preserved. Monks cultivated extensive herb gardens, using their knowledge to prepare remedies for both their own community and, at times, for the local populace. A quirky tidbit: some monastic medical texts contained rather unusual remedies, like using a poultice of crushed snails for certain ailments, or applying crocodile dung for skin conditions. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? It certainly highlights a different approach to wellness. Monasteries also played a crucial role in communication and administration. In a fragmented political landscape where central authority was often weak, monastic networks provided a surprisingly robust system for transmitting information. Letters, official documents, and royal decrees might be copied and disseminated by monks. Many abbots and senior monks served as advisors to kings and nobles, their literacy and knowledge of history and law proving invaluable. Imagine a king needing a document transcribed perfectly, or a message sent across vast distances. Who better to trust than the literate, disciplined monks? The very act of copying, while internal to the monastery, fueled the creation and dissemination of new knowledge. Scribes were not just passive copyists. They were often active participants in scholarship. They might translate texts from Greek to Latin, or from older vernaculars into more contemporary forms. They compiled chronicles of local and regional history, documented legal precedents, and even engaged in original theological or philosophical writing. The intellectual ferment within these quiet walls was often far greater than one might assume. Monasteries also served as cultural centers. They housed beautiful art, intricate architecture, and, of course, the illuminated manuscripts themselves, which were masterpieces of design and craftsmanship. Pilgrims and visitors, even those who couldn't read, would have been deeply impressed by the visual splendor and the tangible evidence of wealth and learning. These artistic endeavors weren't just for internal use. They projected an image of divine order and human ingenuity to the outside world. Think about the establishment of new monastic foundations. When a new monastery was founded, it often brought with it not just religious devotion, but also agricultural expertise, craft skills, and, crucially, books. These new foundations could transform undeveloped regions, clearing land, establishing farms, building churches, and slowly, gently, spreading literacy and learning. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for monastic expansion was purely spiritual or also included strategic, economic, and political motivations. It was likely a complex interplay of all these factors. The economic impact was also significant. Monasteries were often large landowners, managing extensive estates. Their highly organized and literate administration meant they could keep detailed records of harvests, rents, and expenditures, leading to greater efficiency. The production of books itself was an economic activity, creating demand for parchment. Makers, ink producers, and sometimes professional scribes and illuminators outside the monastic walls. Even the everyday lives of ordinary people subtly felt the influence of monasteries. The monastic cycle of bells marked the passage of the day, guiding the rhythms of agricultural labor in surrounding villages. The annual festivals and liturgical calendar centered around the monastery provided a framework for social life. The very language people spoke was slowly influenced by the Latin scholarship preserved and copied within monastic walls. Consider the legacy of individual monks who ventured beyond their cloisters. Many became bishops, advisors, or even saints, bringing the discipline, learning, and administrative skills cultivated in the monastery to the wider church and secular society. These individuals often spearheaded reforms, established new educational institutions, or championed literacy in their respective spheres of influence. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates this external influence. Some monasteries would lend out their precious exemplars to other monasteries or even secular scholars for copying, though often with strict conditions and hefty deposits. This informal interlibrary loan system, though slow and risky, was crucial for the dissemination of texts and the spread of knowledge across Europe. Imagine mailing your priceless original manuscript across a continent in medieval times. That's trust. So, while your days are spent in quiet focus within the scriptorium, you are part of a much larger, more dynamic system. The words you copy, the knowledge you preserve, the skills you embody, all have a profound, if often unseen, influence on the world beyond your monastery's high walls. You are a silent agent of cultural transmission, a quiet force for progress in an age often characterized by stasis. And as the sun sets over the distant fields, tended by your fellow monks, you know that the lamp flickering over your parchment is casting a light far wider than the confines of your carrel, illuminating not just the page, but the very trajectory of medieval civilization. After countless hours spent in the silent chill of the scriptorium, your eyes strained by flickering candlelight, your fingers cramped from the quill, you begin to truly understand the legacy of the medieval scribes, your role and the role of countless monks like you across Europe wasn't just about making copies. It was about ensuring the very survival of knowledge, a monumental task that quietly shaped the future of civilization. You are part of an enduring testament to patience, faith, and the profound power of the written word. Imagine what the world would be like without you and your fellow scribes. The vast majority of classical Greek and Roman literature, philosophy, history, and science would simply have vanished. Without these diligent copyists, the intellectual achievements of antiquity would have been lost to the Dark Ages, forever relegated to the realm of speculation. The works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, Hippocrates, Euclid, all preserved, copied, and transmitted, sometimes through multiple iterations, by the hands of monks like yours. This is a mainstream historical fact. The monasteries were the primary custodians of Western learning for much of the early medieval period. Without their meticulous preservation efforts, the Renaissance, with its rediscovery of classical knowledge, would have been impossible. It's like being the only librarian in the world, and your job is to save all the books from being eaten by invisible BOOKWORMS. Your work also ensured the survival and dissemination of sacred texts, the Bible, the writings of the Church Fathers, liturgical books. These were the core of your copying efforts. By meticulously reproducing these texts, you played a direct role in shaping Christian theology, practice, and spiritual life for centuries. Every Mass, every sermon, every moment of personal devotion in the medieval world was built upon the words you so carefully transcribed. The consistency, or sometimes the charming inconsistencies, within these religious texts directly reflects the human effort of the scriptorium. Beyond grand narratives. The scribes also preserved more mundane, yet equally vital, knowledge. Legal codes, administrative records, chronicles of local events, medical treatises, astronomical observations, and even agricultural manuals all found a place in monastic scriptoria. These texts offer invaluable insights into the daily lives, beliefs, and societal structures of the medieval period. Without these records, our understanding of history would be far shallower, relying mostly on archaeological digs and scattered oral traditions. Consider the sheer scale of the undertaking. Before the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century, every single book in Europe was a handwritten object. Every Bible, every legal code, every philosophical treatise, every epic poem, painstakingly copied by hand. The cumulative labor represented in the surviving medieval manuscripts is almost unfathomable. It represents millions upon millions of hours of dedicated, precise, often uncomfortable work, all for the love of God and the preservation of knowledge. It truly puts your ergonomic desk setup into perspective. The very act of copying, while tedious, fostered a profound respect for learning and literacy. Within the scriptorium, knowledge was a tangible, sacred entity. The physical creation of a book, from raw animal skin to bound volume, instilled a deep appreciation for the effort and wisdom contained within its pages. This culture of reverence for the written word helped lay the groundwork for later intellectual flourishing. One of the quirky tidbits that speaks to this enduring legacy is the sheer artistry found in some of the most famous medieval manuscripts. While not every book was an illuminated masterpiece, examples like the Book of Kells or the Lindisfarne Gospels stand as breathtaking testaments to the scribes and illuminators' skill. These books are not just texts, they are works of art that transcend their original function, continuing to inspire awe and wonder centuries later. They are beautiful because someone, just like you, hunched over them for years, putting their heart and soul into every single line and brushstroke. Historians still debate the extent to which medieval scribes understood the broader historical significance of their work. Were they fully conscious that they were safeguarding civilization's intellectual heritage, or were they simply dutifully performing a monastic task? It was likely a mix. For many, it was a spiritual exercise, a form of active prayer. Yet, the long-term impact was undeniably profound, far exceeding the immediate intentions of any single monk. The decline of the scriptorium as the primary method of book production came with the advent of the printing press. Suddenly, books could be produced faster, cheaper, and in much larger quantities. While this was a revolutionary development that democratized knowledge, it also meant the gradual phasing out of the centuries-old craft of hand-copying the scribes. Roles shifted, perhaps, to maintaining printed books or overseeing the new presses. But the era of the handwritten book as the sole means of knowledge transmission was drawing to a close. It's a bit like the transition from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles, beautiful but ultimately surpassed by new technology. Yet the legacy endures. Every time you read a classical text, every time you consult a historical document, every time you admire a piece of medieval art or architecture, you are standing on the shoulders of these quiet copyists. Their silent labor, performed under the watchful eyes of their abbots and the dim glow of their candles, created the very foundation of Western intellectual tradition. They were the unsung heroes of literacy, the patient guardians of the past. So, as the distant bells ring for Compline and the grand silence descends upon the monastery, you carefully place your finished quill beside the completed page. Your back aches, your eyes are tired, but there is a deep sense of peace that settles over you. You are more than just a monk. You are a link in an unbroken chain, a silent force against oblivion. The faint scent of parchment and ink, the lingering chill in the air, the memory of countless hours spent in focused concentration. These are the quiet trophies of your tireless work. You rise from your carrel, stretch your weary limbs, and join the procession of cowled figures shuffling towards the church for the final prayers. The world outside is still turbulent, but within these walls, knowledge is safe, quietly preserved, one painstaking word at a time. And as you prepare for sleep, the images of letters and illuminated pages dancing behind your eyelids, you know that the flame of knowledge, painstakingly kept alive by candlelight, will continue to burn brightly, illuminating the path for generations yet to come. The monastery is now steeped in profound stillness. The last candles in the scriptorium have been carefully extinguished, and the faint scent of parchment and cold stone hangs in the air. The rhythm of the day, so meticulously observed, has finally wound down, leaving behind only the hushed breath of the sleeping monks. You are nestled in your rough cot, the heavy woolen blanket, a small comfort against the pervasive chill. Your body, weary from the day's precise labors, begins to soften, the tension slowly easing from your shoulders, and the lingering ache in your fingers fading into a dull throb. The sounds of the outside world, if they ever penetrated these thick walls, are utterly gone now, replaced by the gentle hush of quietude. Even your thoughts begin to slow, drifting like smoke in the vast, dark expanse of the dormitory. Feel the soft, steady rhythm of your own breath, a quiet counterpoint to the deep silence that enfolds you. The words, the letters, the history you've journeyed through tonight now begin to blur, dissolving into the peaceful, calming darkness. Allow yourself to float, to gently unfurl with each soft exhalation, as the quiet of this ancient place washes over you, carrying you deeper into tranquility. Let the stillness become your blanket, and the fading echoes of history a soft lullaby. Rest now, softly, completely,